Inside Brains. Stresshacking. Mach Stress zu deinem Freund. Hier erfährst du alles darüber.
Hi, and welcome to a brand new episode of Inside Brains. I am Dina Wittfoth, psychologist, neuroscientist, emotion researcher, and your host for today's show. Do you know this feeling when you're reading a book and you just know that it's more than a book because it's shifting your perspective on life? That's how I felt when I read Esther Perel's first book called Mating in Captivity, Unlocking Erotic Intelligence a few years ago. The way she unapologetically shifts the paradigm about modern love and relationships is enormous. Now her second book has hit the stores and it's equally awesome. It is called The State of Affairs, Rethinking Infidelity, and she was prompted to write this new book because years later, people from all over the world still kept coming back to the chapter on infidelity in her first book, so there was definitely a lot of interest there. And it is a really fascinating puzzle. As Esther so succinctly put it, infidelity is universally forbidden, yet universally practiced. In her first book, she looked at why desire fades in long-term relationships and how we can revive it. In The State of Affairs, she takes us on a journey to find out why even happy people cheat and why infidelity has evolved from a threat to an economic arrangement to a threat for a sense of selves. Esther's view is informed by quite a unique background. She was born and raised in Belgium by her Jewish parents who escaped the Nazi regime and were the sole survivors of their respective families. In their community of Holocaust survivors, Esther found that there were two different kinds of families. Those who didn't die, and those who came back to life. So she grew up experiencing this sense of aliveness, this hunger not only to survive, but to thrive, which has later become one of the backbones of her work. Esther studied in Israel and trained in psychodynamic therapy and family systems therapy, and she later moved to New York, where she still works and lives with her family. Now also a two-time New York Times bestselling author, podcast producer, and organizational consultant for Fortune 500 companies, she continues to travel the world, as you do when you speak 9 languages, and her own intercultural background, together with her intercultural professional perspective, gives her a unique outlook on what we in the Western world perceive to be normal, talking about the fish and the water here. In her work, Esther has found a way to lovingly dissect the never-ending tug-of-war between stability and adventure, togetherness and autonomy, intimacy and desire, and she puts words to the pains and discomforts that so many of us experience in our relationships. What I really like about Esther is that she is as precise as she is non-judgmental. It's a rare quality, especially in so-called experts, to hold space for complexity and to avoid tripping yourself up with oversimplification. I mean, life is messy and it doesn't help to pretend that it isn't. Since her first book came out, Esther has been up to many things, and there are a lot of opportunities to get in touch with her work. First off, you can go check out her web presence at www.estherperel.com. That's ESTHERPEREL. There you'll find info about Esther's work, her clinical training, her podcast, and her blog. And you can sign up for the bi-monthly newsletter, which comes with a free copy of the Intimacy Inventory, a series of questions designed to get you to start thinking about where you learned how to love. Or you might want to watch Esther's TED Talks, which have over 20 million views, or check out the various interviews in different languages, bite-sized videos from her own channel, or follow her on Facebook and Instagram. Obviously, I recommend reading her books, and also go listen to her podcast. In Esther's podcast, called Where Should We Begin?, you get to be the fly on the wall during actual unscripted couples therapy sessions from her practice in New York. It's absolutely real and it's absolutely amazing. I recently had the great pleasure of witnessing one of Esther's keynotes at a conference where she introduced the German translation of her book called Die Macht der Affäre, warum wir betrügen und was wir daraus lernen können. When I sat in the auditorium waiting for the talk to begin, I overheard a couple of conversations between people who were not yet familiar with her work, and one therapist said to the other that after she had left her first husband because he went astray, she now found a good one who's faithful to her. They spoke about how important faithfulness is for the success of marriage, and at some point the other one responded with the classic 5-word reply that Esther often cites, which is, I catch him, he's dead. It was amazing to see how many proverbial light bulbs went on during Esther's talk, and to experience how this comparably short keynote was able to shift people's perspectives on infidelity, affairs, faithfulness, and what it means when people go looking elsewhere. And these are the therapists and coaches who are down there with their patients when shit hits the fan, so shifting their paradigms is a big deal. As you will hear in our conversation, community building and education for her fellow clinicians is a matter that is very dear to Esther. Her platform Sessions is an amazing resource for therapists, coaches, and other practitioners who want to be a part of changing the hurtful narrative our societies hold around sex, love, gender, and human relations. You can find it at sessions.estherperel.com. Needless to say, I was absolutely delighted and honored when Esther agreed to this interview. In fact, you'll probably notice just how honored I felt by paying attention to the excessive use of the words I think at the beginning of my sentences. And I hope you will enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Without further ado, Esther Perel. You said once that when you see a dogma, you start questioning it. And I really love that because I think, first of all, it's very close to what I do or what I like to do. And I think that's just something that we all really need more of, because there are so many things that people think are true because they heard it from somebody who is an expert in the field. And it's also the same thing in medicine. I think there are a lot of people who do eminence-based medicine and not evidence-based medicine.
Very good. Never heard that.
It's I think what a lot of people do, and I see why that might be a good thing if you're young and you're just getting into a topic and you try to find your way into it. Of course, you look to the people who have been in the field for a long time. But then I think once in a while it's really good to start questioning the things that you think are true, and find out whether that's still the case or ever was the case. And so that was what the podcast and all your work really did for me, opening up the conversation about these things that we take for granted, like the way marriage should work or the way sex and intimacy should work. And also I think it's basically training for psychologists for free. And it's like, this is such an awesome opportunity. So I've been telling everybody about it, like, you have to listen. If you're a psychologist, you have to listen to this because it's like free training. Who wouldn't want that? So I really, really liked it.
Because you've actually never heard most of the couples therapists do the work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's also something that we can learn so much from, just watching other people, listening to other people do the things that we're interested in, and just try to copy what they do and try to see if it fits and try it on for size.
The main other place where people can train with me is on my digital platform called Sessions.
Yeah, I've already done that as well.
And
it's awesome.
That people find on my website. And that too was very thought out because I didn't want to create a school. Mm-hmm. I didn't want just to have one method. I wanted to be the person who can create a salon or a community where you can come to learn with me from all the people that I learned from. Mm-hmm. And you can try it out for free for 2 weeks and just see what it speaks to. But every month I interview basically somebody else from whom I got something. Mm-hmm. And I think if I were, and I know there's a lot of young therapists on there because it you do need someone who curates and selects a little bit, mm-hmm. Otherwise you don't know where you go first. And I like your different distinction between evidence and eminence. I mean, and even evidence, the truth of today in science is often the joke of tomorrow.
Yes, exactly.
So let's not be so sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also the jokes of today might be the truth of tomorrow. So it works both ways. And oftentimes when we do something that is not very popular yet, then we get ridiculed or people say, oh, no, that can't be true. But I think it's really important to get this kind of feeling of, no, but there is something there. I see it.
I see in people that something is working, and I want to get a better grasp of that. And I think also this is what I try to do with my scientific work now, because I've been working on emotion regulation in a very classical way. So usually it's very much about cognitive control. So how do I change the way I think so that I change the way I feel? And that does work for a short amount of time.
And for some.
But it doesn't really have that many lasting effects. And I think many of the modern people who do therapy and try to rethink therapy as well have come to the conclusion that you need the body. You need to include the body a lot more, and to combine both the body and...
So you do somatic experiencing now?
I do something called PEP. It's process and embodiment focused psychology. It's based on emotional freedom techniques, but it's a lot more. So it's a tapping technique plus some cognitive restructuring. And we also do science on that. And I think it's really a very promising field. But I notice a lot of resistance when I talk to other people who do more like cognitive behavioral therapy or something like that.
Would you say that you are still very cerebral in Germany?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, I think so. Not only in Germany, I think in the academic world of emotion regulation science, it's very much cerebral. It's a lot about...
You have SE in Germany?
What is that?
Somatic experiencing?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And ADP, Advanced Experiential Dynamic Therapy, Diana Foscher?
I'm not aware of that really.
Then take a look at her first book on affect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think...
they do a very different kind of tracking that is much more body-centered and probably very useful, not probably, and very useful for working with trauma.
Yeah, so I've just recently changed my focus from this more cognitive world, and also I think because I'm working in a neuroradiology department, so I'm very far away from from my psychological roots.
Oh la la!
Yeah, so I'm trying to reel that back in, because it's I studied this because I'm so interested in people and what makes their minds work and their hearts work, and how does that work together. So I'm really...
What did you think of this book?
Of this book?
Yeah, I see the German edition here.
Yeah. I very much liked it. I pre-ordered the English version before it came out, and I read it right away, and I can see why so many people like the way you speak about this topic, because it's very curious. As you said, you're a curious person, and I can really see that. You're very open. You're very much about asking questions and trying to understand, instead of, okay, so now we have this and we need categories to put that in and drawers to put that in, and, make it look tidy and neat, and it's not. It's messy. And I think you have an awesome voice in opening space and holding space for the messiness, and that's what I very much liked about it. But I think if we talk about the book, I think it's also in the English title, but the subtitle in German is Why We Have Affairs and What We Can Learn from Them. And I imagine that there are probably a lot of people who get kind of triggered by that last part, like learning something from affairs. I think for people who would like to have it neat and clean, that is kind of not in the picture. Is that your experience as well? Or how do people react to your attempt to understand both sides of affairs?
Well, if I ask any audience if they have been affected by the experience of infidelity in their life, either because they are the child of a parent who had an affair or fell in love with someone else who left, or was because they are the child of an illicit relationship, or because they are the friend on whose shoulder somebody's been weeping for days, or because they are the friend to whom somebody has been confiding for months, or because they are one of the three primary protagonists of the adulterous triangle. 90% of the people in the audience will raise their hands. And at that moment, it becomes very clear that I'm not just writing a book about two people, nor am I looking at infidelity as a story of two people. It's systemic, it's societal, it's intergenerational. There are at least three people involved, but generally it is about an entire network of connections. If you only want to look at it from the place of a moral offense, and then probably this is not the book. That book has been written, and there are many of them out there. If you open to thinking about this a little differently, because you are one of those many characters that I've just described, it has been a book that has opened up worlds for people. Worlds. And I know it because just from the TED Talk alone, which I don't know how many millions it has now, some 12, 15 million people, but I got 1,500 letters myself. That's a lot of people telling me a lot of dark stories. And so I know that, sometimes there's a little bit of an anticipation that if you don't instantly say it is the worst thing, that means that you're saying it's okay. Or when you say that some good can come out of a crisis and that we understand the concept of post-traumatic growth and we apply it to every other crisis, how come we don't apply it to this one? There is a fear sometimes that people have when they approach this book, or because sometimes people have said Perel this, Perel that. The truth is that I rarely, after people have read it, hear them say that. There is nowhere that I ever condone or encourage or justify or... This is a phenomenon that exists all over the world, that has been historically condemned and universally practiced. It has accompanied relationships throughout history, regardless of the model of marriage. And today we have a particular view about it because of the particular expectations of marriage that we have. And it has fundamentally changed its meaning and its consequences. And the literature has changed as well, accordingly, the clinical literature. But in a very short amount of time, infidelity has become one of the leading causes of divorce, which it never was and still isn't in the vast majority of the world, by the courtesy of women, of course. To look at it just from the perspective of victim and perpetrator and two people is already inaccurate. There are more than two people in this story. And to take a phenomenon that attaches itself to 90% of the population and to only look at it through one lens doesn't begin to capture the complexity of it. So that's what I try to do. I try to write a book that captures the complexity of one of the most important crises of modern relationships, to try to understand why this has become such a crisis, what it means, and how it becomes a lens for looking at our expectations of relationships, at how we view marriage, at how we view personal happiness, at how we view the role of sexuality in our life, at how we view, what we think we should be suffering or not. And it's that. It's not a book about infidelity as much as it's a book about modern love and modern relationships through the lens of one of these most painful crises. What does it tell us? Why this crisis? Because it involves lies, secrecy, jealousy, passion, love, deception, revenge, possessiveness. Basically, the entire human drama exists in this phenomenon, and usually you have to go to the opera for that. And yet we see it in our offices. And that's what I try to do. I try to come up with a different perspective that I think is more helpful, that addresses the multiple realities of the multiple people that are part of the story, that deals with the sociocultural reality behind this, puts this very much in context and says you can't apply it in the same way. I was in Israel last week, and I did a 2-day clinical training on working with infidelity. And the two groups that had the most in common were the Israeli Arabs and the Orthodox Jews. It was a moment nobody will forget, because we were talking about how do you work with secrets in therapy. And many of the Western, more egalitarian-oriented therapists think you should not be keeping secrets. Well, that is very good when you live in the West, in an environment in which the consequences for the revelation of the secrets is the same for the men and for the women. But when you live in a society where you can either be killed or beaten up, or you have to be destroyed because you are destroying the honor of the family, the consequences of the revelation of any kind of information about you, lady, is very different. And that was the Israeli Arab. And when you listen to the Orthodox, if anywhere he was to find out anything about her, she would become shmura, which means she becomes an untouchable. And those two very different people, people from very different religions and backgrounds, understood power structures in a way that the more liberal Israeli westernized therapist did not. It's that kind of therapy that I want to talk about. It's therapy that exists in the reality of people's socio-political context. It's not the same everywhere. And we can't just go around with some beautiful principles that sound nice, but don't fit the reality of the people who have to live with the consequences.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that also entails the danger.
That anecdote makes sense now. I just remembered it, but it's that I'm trying to talk about. The last thing I need to do is to legitimize this thing. That's not my point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also your cultural perspective and putting this into a socioeconomic context is one of the reasons why this discussion, or your way of phrasing it, is so open and doesn't create a dogma, because it's easy to jump to the conclusion that what we see here is normal and therefore maybe even biological. Like, for example, men are made to roam because that's what we see, but is that really true? And even if it is it helpful to phrase it that way? Or do we open up the door to say, well, maybe it is, but maybe it isn't, and let's see where we can go from there? So I think it's very helpful and very necessary also in this more globalized world to have all these different voices from different places and to see, like, but is it always like this? Is it like this in every culture and for every person? And then broadening the conversation and
look, relationships take place in context. Therapy takes place in context. And even in Germany, or like when I'm in New York, we see people from many different parts of the world. And we cannot do the same therapy. That's my point of view, but I'm never right. I just state my point of view.
Yeah.
And, same on the infidelity and the gender discrepancy. We have no idea what women do, because women have never had the freedom to do it. And as long as there are 9 countries where she still can be killed or stoned to death, she will do what keeps her safe. That doesn't mean that she is that fundamentally different from the man. But she has always chosen security over desire. That's given, that's clear. She had all reasons to do so. We have all kinds of evolutionary theories for attributing different sexualities to men and women. There's parts of that. But then after that come the rest of your social conditioning. And then people have all kinds of theories to justify why men are natural roamers and why it's in their nature to do so and all of that. We don't know what is the nature of women when it comes to sexuality. She's never had the opportunity to explore it, period.
Do you see a difference in the millennial generation? Because I think when it comes to freedom, they're probably the most free, equal, egalitarian kind of generation that has been around.
Correct.
Ever.
And also the most romantic. And also very romantic. I think that you see different things. I mean, the millennials are the children of the divorced and the disillusioned. Let's begin by that. So the millennials are trying very hard to marry two sets of values. The value for a committed relationship that embraces stability and security and continuity and all of that, with the value of individual fulfillment and self-expression and freedom within the relationship, not just before. And the marriage of these two sets of values is the big challenge. How to make it last without compromising myself completely. As a result, what you find often in millennial relationships is something that we call stable ambiguity. Just enough involvement not to be alone, but not too much commitment to lose your freedom. And that is the status that a lot of millennial young people find themselves in, particularly before they settle with somebody. And at the same time, millennials are also part of, romantic consumerism. So what do they have to do? They have to find their one and only on an app between thousands of people. That's a complicated process. And the new ritual of commitment is that you delete your app because you have found that person with whom you're going to have massive amounts of expectations, unprecedented amount of expectations. Therefore, when infidelity occurs, it's worse because it's not meant to happen. There is no notion that this comes with marriage, that this happens, that this is a shadow story that has accompanied it. If I wait 15 years of sexual and relational nomadism till my early 30s to then finally settle with you because you are my soulmate, this isn't meant to happen. And that's what I mean by they are the most romantic new generation. They're more romantic than me as a boomer in that sense. And in the same way, there is all kinds of new conversations among millennials about consensual non-monogamy and polyamory and ways to actually bring the notion of personal sexual self-expression and all of that and emotional expression within the context of the relationship. So that too, you see a kind of an entrepreneurial mindset, a startup mentality of disrupting the old structures and coming up with new ones. And that applies no less to marriage. It's very refreshing.
Yeah.
Don't know where it goes, but it's very refreshing.
Definitely. And I think also finding new ways of learning to regulate yourself is an important prerequisite for, say, polyamory or rethinking marriage. Being able to deal with your own demons in a way that is healthy and works, I think, is very important in that sense. So it's
important, but it's part of a zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist is that the burdens of the self have never been heavier. Because if you have to do your own self-regulation, and you have to find your own decisions, and you have to deal with your own demons, and you have to make your own choices, and you have to know if you're happy and happy enough, that's a lot of burden to carry. There's a reason we are dealing with massive amounts of insomnia and anxiety and perfection issues and all of that, because in light of having to make so many decisions, an enormous amount of uncertainty and self-doubt is creeping up on us.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think that it doesn't come without a price.
Definitely. Yeah, I've just been on the train ride to Bad Kissing, and I've been talking to two young students who said the same thing, that they feel they have a lot of freedom, but they also have to make a lot of choices, and sometimes they're not sure whether it's a gift or a burden, or maybe it's both.
It's both. Yeah. Nobody wants to go back to where we were, but people have to recognize that what we have now can be very heavy at times. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's where the role of psychologist is really becoming important. And I would not embrace only the self-regulation, actually. I think that it's a combination of things. You can't live on such a level of self-reliance only. You have to have autonomy, but you have to have a good amount of interdependence. People are way too isolated. There's a reason every second book about relationships these days talks about belonging and loneliness. That's part of your zeitgeist of self-regulation. And we need both.
Yeah.
When we were too belonging and too rooted and too stuck, we wrote a lot of stuff about needing freedom and individualization. When we are in an era where we are completely into self, God knows what, but the self word stands in front of the rest, it becomes a problem too.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally see that. I think also that our feeling of being interdependent needs to come up to speed to all the self-actualization, self-whatever, just like what you said. Finding new ways of relating that can accommodate a certain amount of personal freedom, and having personal freedom that can accommodate for the fact that we are never alone and we're always connected, I think is very hard to do, but this is, I think, what I see in my generation.
It's not hard to do. What do you see? You see people who don't know to knock at other people's doors.
Yes.
And I much of the work that I do at this point is helping people, especially the young people, to knock at people's doors, to reach out, to call, to speak in person, not just to text, not just to go on social, to actually have gatherings, to invite somebody in your kitchen, to do the old 3D in-person stuff. To get an alarm clock in their bedroom, to take the phones out, etc., etc. It's like the old stuff becomes the countercultural stuff. You have too many people who are spending their time not lifting their head and looking at other people. And they don't know anymore what to do when they are in the presence of other people. They'd rather sit at the bar but into their phone than actually look at who's around them. And all of that is not boding well. That part, and they're hungry for something else, but they don't know how to do it. So somehow that's part of what I have to tell them. What do you say? What kind of questions do you ask? How do you connect? How do you establish a rapport, etc., etc. And we will start to see more and more people entering our offices who are really requiring the basics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The basics.
Yeah.
But the hunger is there, so it's not like we need to convince anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
There's never been more festivals. There's never been more ways to create gatherings than what's going on now. Since people don't meet in the church, they will create other rituals, because that's part of our human condition. And people are desperate to look for in-person, contact, experiences. Everybody is using the same word, experience, user experience. Mm-hmm. Why are we so freaking busy with experience? It used to be called prayer.
Yeah. And I think also this is part of what I saw in the science of my field, at least, is that this part of actually being somewhere and doing something and maybe feeling awkward and still doing it, that's part of a skill set you need also to have social contact, because it's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be pleasant. It's not always going to just flow, and you have to be able to stay there and try the next thing and the next thing, and maybe this works and maybe this works, and not get beaten down and not turn around and run, and just be present with the feeling of maybe it's just not nice right now, but it might get better. And I think that that's one thing that is very helpful in a lot of respects in all fields of life.
I mean, that's part of the mindfulness, thinking as well. Look, much of my training at this point is also to make sure that people are not alone, that they feel part of a community, that a community is not just a particular method that you use, but an approach to life. You get it, just about everywhere. When you read my book, it's an approach to life, not just an approach to a problem. When you listen to the podcast, it's an approach to life. When you watch the videos on the session training platform, it's an approach to life. And the life of the therapist as well. What is it like today to be a clinician? Particularly for me, it's a clinician. And a clinician who works in the realm of relationships. That's my main focus. What is changing in modern relationships? How do the fundamental human needs stay the same, but the way in which we try to meet them changes? And how do the modes of communication influence the needs? This kind of back and forth. I think in that sense it's a very exciting moment in our field, and it intersects with brain science. It intersects with a lot of things. I am more on the anthropological, cultural front, but I'm very aware that there are many pieces that interact with each other. Which is why I interviewed those people, as part of the same conversation. And that's it. That's really the where I find myself at this particular moment. Mm-hmm. How do you hold the things that have been, the things that are rooted already and that are part of a certain tradition, and build around that and create things that make sense for the lives that we live today? Mm-hmm. You don't want to come to therapy and feel that the person that's talking to you doesn't really understand the world you live in and gives you advice or gives you responses that feel like sounds good, but don't know how to apply any of this. It doesn't fit my world anymore. Mm-hmm.
And in your experience, how helpful is it to do something that involves the body, to teach people to ground into their body?
Emotions are embodied experiences. I am a psychodramatist. I train in bioenergetics. I come from movement. I have an expressive arts therapy background. I didn't wait till now to understand that. So I have used the arts. I have used other things than just words. I have used music and movement forever. I think therapy is an experience. It's not just a thought or a conversation. It has to be experiential. You have to experience something new and different. You can't be going to therapy to do the same thing you've been doing at home or being stuck. So I'm not a fundamental practitioner of somatic experiencing or bioenergetics or any of these things today, but I'm a sex therapist, so I can't not think about the body, and I'm a relationship therapist, so I can't not think about the body. I think we can't live without touch. So I do a lot of exercises in my office with the people, small things, nothing, but that involve touch, that involve breath, that involves movement, that involves standing, rotation, voice, all of that. I come from the theater too, way back when, so all of these things are in my toolbox. And I think today we absolutely need a broad toolbox. Can't just have one set of tools. You can build a bunch of stuff with one set of tools, but it is limited. And what I have wanted for myself and what I like to teach other people is to have a very rich toolbox. And that means listening in on other perspectives and other fields in which you won't be the expert, but in which you will have learned to include that as part of the perspective. Because otherwise we become siloed, like the rest of society, in which everybody just talks to themselves and to people who reinforce your own idea, and then the field becomes one big confirmation bias with a few silos that operate in parallel. And there are those people, and then there are people who are really anchored into developing one model in depth, and they go vertically down, and then there are those of us who are doing the more synthesizing, and we are more horizontal. And a rich field needs both.
Yes.
That's the thing. It's not this or that. A rich field needs both of those. So I am the synthesizer and the person who brings together those very people who are the vertical excavators who go deep into one modality. And I bring them together with each other to talk in my trainings. But then I do the horizontal, and I do the envelope around. And I think that when you do it like that, you know, this will be an interesting field.
Yes, definitely. And I think one thing you said on the Debbie Millman podcast, or you talked about this, is that your mother said that you should be an interpreter and you've always been good with languages. And Debbie Millman said that you are an interpreter. And I think this very much applies to translating the more professional, psychological view to the people, to everybody, and opening that up, that bringing that knowledge to people, but also what you just said, bringing together people from your discipline and kind of dragging them out of their holes to talk to each other and really broaden their view for a while. And I think this is also very important and something that I often miss in science. Because there, obviously, everybody is drilling into their own field very much, which is why I enjoy being here in the psychological community and, learning to speak each other's language. I think is so crucial.
I did an event with 8 neuroscientists, and the reason I was invited in is because I was asked to actually humanize the conversation, translate it. It was a fascinating thing. People who were doing single-cell neuron research, people who were doing studies on the olfactive, people who were doing studies on the teen brain, people who were doing studies on schizophrenia and autism, and on like this. It was a fascinating conversation. I was a weird bird to them, and they were weird birds to me, and we enjoyed flying.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I imagine that must have been great when people actually start talking, because everybody has so much to tell. And so much knowledge to bring. And I think sometimes we forget how exciting it is what we do. And talking to others who are new, maybe, to what we're doing and seeing their excitement really sparks it again in myself. At least I notice that when I get frustrated with work and then I talk to somebody, I say, I'm doing emotion regulation. And they're like, wow, this is so cool. Tell me more.
That's right.
So I think also you learn so much by telling others and teaching others. You learn so much about your own field.
You learn by writing and you learn by teaching. And I learn by translating. I do clinical work and teach in 7 languages, and that's when you begin to also see what is essential and what doesn't translate well and all of that. But teaching is an amazing way to know and writing. It helps you really distill it and communicate it. Voila. Okay.
Thank you very much,
You're
Esther.
welcome.
It was my pleasure.
Me too.
And I hope you have a wonderful stay here and meet more people and get the chance to talk in person to a lot of them.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Welcome back, and thank you for listening to our conversation. Isn't she just amazing? If you'd like to learn more about Esther's work, please make sure to check out her webpage, www.estherperel.com, and go read her books, Mating in Captivity, Unlocking Erotic Intelligence, and her new one, The State of Affairs, Rethinking Infidelity. Of course, I highly recommend listening to her podcast called Where Should We Begin? It's like free training for professionals and free therapy for clients. You get to listen in on actual unscripted relationship therapy sessions where real people from all walks of life let you in on their struggles and solutions, something you will not get anywhere else. Seasons 1 and 2 are available for free on iTunes, and Season 3 is currently available from Audible. If you're a therapist or a coach ready to dig in deeper, you can also train with Esther from anywhere in the world. All you need is a computer and an internet connection, and you can go check out Sessions, which is Esther's educational salon and community for couples therapists, coaches, and educators. Just go to sessions.estherperel.com, where Esther and her team offer exclusive resources for clinicians who want to get a better grip on all things relationship, sex, and intimacy. Plus, you get to be a part of a lively community of experts who will enrich your work and your life. As always, we will pop in all the resources I mentioned in the show notes. So again, thanks for listening. Make sure you grab Esther's new book, The State of Affairs, Rethinking Infidelity, and we hope to have you back for the next episode of Inside Brains.